All right, friends, good morning. It's time for the hands-free drive to work because, as you know, you can keep your hands on the steering wheel and at the very same time learn to lead yourself through the weeds of work. So don't touch that phone, but just hit play, and we'll talk about some ways that we can manage ourselves well today. You know, we've been talking about this over and over again. We haven't really given it a name, but ultimately we've been talking about a systematic way to manage ourselves through the weeds of work. And I'll tell you, I call that entire system last to least. And the reason I call it last to least is because I discovered that when we work with ourself at the center, we are often trying to go from worst to first. We look at all the things that we don't do well, and then we try to make sure that we climb over other people until we do those things better than other people. We often will compare ourselves to our peers. We look around us and we judge our own efforts by the people who are around us. If we do a little better than them, then we did a good job. If we didn't do so as good as John down the street or Jane over by the other office, then we didn't do a good job. And so often we judge ourselves, we judge our work, we guide ourselves through the weeds of work and how we go from worst to first. But what I discovered is really, if we begin to look at work and how it functions, what is the true purpose of work? It's always a met need. And so instead of guiding ourselves through the weeds of work by trying to go from worst to first, by trying to 10x my life, we can go through the weeds of work more skillfully, more productively, more engaged continually in our work if we start to guide ourselves by the principles of last to least. And I'll tell you where I got where one of the main quotes that I read that really started getting me thinking in that direction is by an author, C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis is famous for tweezing out some particular our ways we think about things that is unique to him in all of history. And one of the things that he tweezed out the way we think about it is pride and humility. And he said, if you truly meet a humble person today, somebody who looks at themselves not as worst to first, but last to least, he said, you'll see somebody who is not just a greasy, smarmy person who goes around saying, of course, I am no one. He said, no, that's not the kind of person who's truly humble. He said, today if you meet someone who's truly humble, you may walk away from a conversation and say, he says, he's from England, that was a pleasant chap who seemed to really take an interest in what I had to say. And he said, he won't be thinking about humility. He won't be thinking about himself at all. Do you see that? He said, if you meet a humble person today, it won't be somebody who's walking around saying, oh, I'm nobody, of course I'm nothing. He said, if you meet a truly humble person today, that person will not be thinking about humility. They won't be thinking about themselves at all. Another author said it this way, that humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's just thinking of yourself less. Rick Warren wrote that in The Purpose-Driven Life. That is revolutionizing to the way we think about humility, to the way we think about arrogance or pride. Thinking of, wanting to be a humble person is a good trait, but walking around trying to tell people that you're humble often points to the fact that you may not be. Because true humility is two sides of one coin. One, it's not thinking too highly of ourselves, and that's why we need things like the confrontation to come in and make sure that we are accurately assessing ourselves. So don't think too highly of yourself. But the other thing is that you look to the interest and needs of others more than the interest of yourselves. In an equation, you take the variables and you decrease the amount of weight that you put on the variable of self and my needs, and you increase the amount of weight that you put on the variable of meeting the needs of the neighbors and the neighborhoods that we serve. So that's why we call this system last to least. we are becoming the least important in the work equation, and making our neighbors' needs and the needs of the neighborhood the most important variable in the work equation. I'm convinced that working this way makes us more productive. Listen, you think about it. It has to. It makes us more productive, more engaged in our work, because it's in line with what's true and what's real. And I'm going to tell you this, where this really, the last to least concept came from. And then I'm going to tell you a couple more things, just a recap of what is last to least. What are we really calling this thing last to least? And you'll hear it again. This is this systematic way to lead me through the weeds of work. And it came about because the first time I started to lead others was when I took an agency over in Commerce. It was in my first agency. I walked in the door, started to lay out some of these same principles, and I got permission. Chip, if you watch this, Chip knows I asked him for permission to tell this story. So, and he said it was absolutely great. So I walked in the door, and Chip was an agent in that office. Chip was third from the bottom in the ranking reports on that October 2015 when I walked in the door. And I started to lay out these principles. And we went through them on a weekly basis together. He and I talked about these things. And there were other people in the office. And I remember one person in the office said, "Hey, you're not really, I thought you were going to come here and really change things up." I said, "No, we are. We're changing things up right now." See, he thought there was only just a small difference between what he was doing and what I was doing. But over time, remember we talked about this, a small difference over time winds up in two totally different areas. A small difference over time brings about massively different results. So I said, no, we're doing something different. He said, "No, I thought you were going to give us a magic bullet." This was not Chip. This was somebody else. So I thought you were going to give us a magic bullet. I said, "No, I am. You're not hearing me. This is a magic bullet. It will change the entire way you work. It will change the way you lead yourself through the weeds of work, make you massively productive and massively engaged in your work." And Chip believed that. Chip believed that. We sat across from each other Friday after Friday, and Chip believed that. And we had conversation after conversation. Really, it's a rich part of my life as I remember it. I tell him this often, man. He is a rich part of my memories. And so as time went by, though, Chip began to climb up that ranking report. He went from third from last in the entire company. He started to get in the middle, and then he started to get in the top, 15%. And so I started, I relapsed. I went back to the old way. I started calling Chip Sid Bream. Do you know who Sid Bream is? Sid Bream was the first baseman for the 1990 and 91 Braves when they made the massive turn from worst to first. The Braves were the last place team in the National League, and then the next year they were the first place team in the National League. And so I was around 8 years old when this happened. And so that was a big part of my childhood. I loved the Braves. I loved going to watch the Braves. And I remember when they went from worst to first. We were so excited. We were watching, I got to stay up late and watch the games. And so I was remembering this huge turnaround with Chip, and I'm like, good grief, he's going from ranked last. And before the year was over, I called him Sid Bream for the second half of about 2 months there. And then before it was over, he was ranked third in the entire company of the most productive, most engaged agents in the entire company. Ranked third overall from last. So I actually went to Chip, and I said, "Chip, I'm sorry. I've been telling you that I've been calling you Sid Bream. We've been joking around about it, and you have made this massive turnaround. But you didn't go from worst to first. You weren't worried about first place at all, because one of the things I asked Chip to do was throw the ranking report out the window. I asked him to stop looking at the ranking report. I asked him to start meeting the needs of the clients and the neighborhoods that he served." And he took that seriously, and he started to do it. And yes, he did rise up the ranking report, but at the same time, that was never the point in the first place. And so I apologized to him that day. I started to think, if he didn't go worst to first, what did he do? I said, "Chip, you went from last to least. You became a humble person. You started to really act for the needs of other people, not just the needs of yourself. You started to put yourself in uncomfortable situations to make other people comfortable. You started to put yourself under stress so that other people could have stress relieved from them. It was a really cool, really, really beautiful thing to watch. And so that's where this whole entire, the way we name it is last to least, but that's where it comes from. And this is what last to least is, and we've been learning some of these things. One, it's a new equation for success. Instead of 10x, it's 10y plus x. We talked about that. There's a video on it. If you hadn't watched it, you should. We talked about it's a new illustration for success. Last to least is a new illustration for success because last to least is a system of self-management. That's why I say, and we'll talk about this more, but last to least is a prequel or a prerequisite to every great leadership book ever. Every great leadership book ever, last to least, is a prequel or a prerequisite to leadership. It's the story that comes before the story because self-management necessarily precedes leadership. Self-leadership. You'll never learn how to lead others until you first learn how to lead yourself. And so because of that, last to least is a new illustration. It's a new illustration because we said we need a guide as we lead ourselves through the weeds of work. We need a guide, and we all have a guide we learned from David Foster Wallace, but all we get to do is choose which guide we will follow. So last to least is a new equation for success. It's a systematic way of leading myself through the weeds of work. It's a new illustration for success. And I want you to be able to use it. I want you to be able to, every single day as we come into work, as we drive into work, I want you to be able to think differently, because I know we'll never think differently until we'll never act differently until we decide differently. And we'll never decide differently until we think differently. So I hope these last couple weeks that we've learned how to think differently about our work. We've learned how to see a systematic way to lead ourselves, not guided by money, recognition, approval, all these other things, but guided by the needs of our neighbors. And I hope you see that this could make you massively productive, massively engaged. If you are a leader and you begin to help, other people around you to be able to be engaged and productive in their work, this will be a great way to teach them to lead themselves. That's what I'm trying to do with you guys. Not trying to just lead you, but teach you how to lead yourself. You know this. If you give someone a fish, they eat for a day. If you teach them to fish, they eat for a lifetime. In the same way, if you lead someone, they'll go in the right direction for a certain period of time. But if you teach someone to lead themselves, now they can not only go out and go in the right direction for an extended period of time, but they can actually teach other people how to lead themselves as well, which puts multiplication on the effects of our leadership. So can we do it today? Let's do this together. Let's say, I'm going to go last to least today. I've learned these principles over the last few weeks. Listen, I'm going to do it. I'm going all in. And from here on, we're going to talk about how to decide differently and how to act differently. So I hope this is helping you. Shoot me questions or comments if you want more clarification on something. Thank y'all so much for watching.